would like to welcome you to today's webinar, NearShoring to Latin America, Part Dos. My name is Arlene Itori, and I'm a webinar coordinator for the Outsourcing Institute. And it is our pleasure to be the host of today's event. I'll be working in the background to help answer any technical or general questions that you may have. But before we begin, I'd like to quickly tell you about a few tools that you'll be able to use throughout today's session. First, we encourage you at any time during the presentation to submit your questions to today's speakers. To do this, click on the questions box, type your question in the space provided, and click on the Submit button. During today's presentation, we'll be asking poll questions to get to know you better and to help ensure that the content is relevant to your specific needs. When the poll appears, be sure to select the answer that best fits each question. I'd also like to remind everyone that today's attendee list has been kept private. So without further ado, I will now turn it over to our moderator, Frank Casal, founder and CEO of the Outsourcing Institute. Thank you.
Great, and thank you, Arlene, and welcome everyone. And to some of you, welcome back to what, in essence, is the second part of what ended up being a very lively and well-attended webinar we had barely 3 weeks ago with regard to nearshoring to Latin America. Our goal here really is to, we basically netted down the questions that were submitted the previous webinar, and our goal here really is to answer at least a good portion of the questions that we didn't get to last time. Apparently this is a very popular topic. Many of you, regardless of what side of the table you sit on with regard to outsourcing, you may be a practitioner, a provider, an advisor, an analyst, and as I look at today's registration, all the above are present. Apparently each of you have an interest in this topic. So our goal here today is to answer the questions that we have specifically crafted up, and then beyond that to answer any additional questions that you may have. We're going to do our best to squeeze everything in this time. It was a challenge last time. We'll do our best, but I think we'll be there. I have a great panel with me, so I'm really here as the moderator today. I have several gentlemen who I'll pass the baton to momentarily who are truly experts with regards to nearshore and Latin America. As you may recall, Tony Batalla presented the last webinar, did a wonderful job. Tony's still here, and he'll help us recap and kind of kick things off in a moment. We also have Robert Jansen and Bob Hartman, and again, I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves. So the format is slightly different than last time. Think interactive virtual panel, and this promises to be a great session as the last one was as well. So before we kick things off, Bob, how about I pass it to you, if you can, maybe in a minute or two, just give a brief background on yourself and your expertise.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you, Frank. I'm Bob Hartman. I'm a senior advisor to the Outsourcing Institute, working a lot with their chapters in Washington, D.C. and Atlanta, Georgia. I'm also an independent outsourcing consultant. I've been working in this space for the last 25 years with companies like EDS and Logica out of London, England. For the last 10 years, I've been working kind of solo on my own, working with various companies that either want to consider outsourcing and are trying to figure out where to go, what countries to consider, or companies that want to offer their outsourcing services and help them with a strategy to enter the outsourcing market. Last 8 years have been a lot of emphasis on offshore because that's kind of just the way this whole industry's been going lately. Frank?
Great, thank you, Bob. Robert Jansen, can you please do the same as well? Thank you.
Yes. Hi, Frank. Hi, Bob. Hi, Tony. Hi, everyone else. I'm half American, half Brazilian. I've been in the IT space in both countries since 1986 and been involved with the outsourcing, offshoring space since 2005, 2006. Currently, I act as a third-party advisor for Brazilian vendors trying to penetrate the United States market, and also for foreign vendors trying to penetrate the Brazilian market. So it's a two-way street, outbound and inbound.
Great, thanks, Robert. Tony, and maybe for those who who are new on this presentation or weren't on the last, maybe you could do a quick refresh on your background.
Okay, thanks, Frank. Welcome, everybody. For those of you who are on the last one, welcome back. I'm a partner with Think Solutions, and I've been in this space working in IT and in outsourcing for over 25 years. Worked with IBM and Price Waterhouse and TPI, and did some time working in a client arena as well. We specialize in assisting clients with all aspects of sourcing and trying to understand strategy to executing transactions, as well as helping clients with cost reduction and transformation initiatives.
Great, thanks, Tony. And just to get my quick plug in for Roadshow, both Tony and Bob are chairing roadshows. Tony in Houston in the fall, Bob will be chairing the Roadshow in D.C. in the spring. So if you end up at either one of those events, you'll see them. And one other thing I want to mention, we have of the 4 or 5 of us, I guess, including Arlene, that are on this call. 3 of us are working from home. 2 of the 3 of us have a dog in the house. I won't say which 2 it is, but we've done our best to prepare to avoid any background noise. But if you do hear that, we do apologize. And if you guess which one of us it is, we'll make sure there's a prize. So with that said, Tony, why don't I pass the baton to you, and you could kind of recap what we touched on in the last presentation so we can then dovetail from there.
Sure, Frank. So let's take a quick look at the topics we covered last time, just to give everyone a feel for that. First of all, we talked a little bit about trends and directions and what are some reasons for doing business in Latin America. We went through kind of a near-shore, offshore comparison and talked about some of the decision points that people were considering and some of the pros and cons. We went into the different countries and talked about what are some of the considerations for making decisions on sourcing in different countries. We talked about some approaches and strategies to use if you're considering sourcing, and how do you take all this kind of information and distill it into some kind of a process that you can use to make decisions. And some lessons learned in governance. And out of this topic that we had some kind of general thoughts. So let's cover those and talk a little bit about kind of the general thoughts we had last time. Arlene, can you go to the next?
Yeah, we just need that next slide, Arlene.
I've now put the polling question up.
Okay, so if you look at the polling question, what we'd like to talk to you guys about is, for those of you considering nearshore outsourcing, which services would be candidates? So just select all that you're considering: BPO or business process outsourcing, applications development, applications management or maintenance, call center, or other. We'll give you a few minutes to respond.
Okay, the poll will be closing in 10 seconds.
So interesting, if you look at the results, applications development and management are kind of the leaders, in balance with BPO and call center. That's pretty representative of what we see. I would say that BPO and call center have quite a lot of services down there as well, and call center is probably one of the fastest growing areas, interestingly enough. So,
Tony, before we jump off of this slide, I'm curious what you would think if you would have asked this question maybe 7, 8 years ago. How would you see the ratios playing out?
I think you would have seen more BPO and call center were kind of offerings, and you didn't see as much application development and management as far as outsourcing options.
Okay. Thank you.
So Arlene, do you want to go to the next slide? So based on the last seminar, I wanted to go over some general observations that we had coming out of there that can kind of kick us off and lead us into the next series of questions. The first thing was that there was definitely a lot of interest in the topic, and it was one of the most widely attended webinars that we've had. There were a lot of questions regarding the comparisons between Latin America and India. I think pricing and capability were a lot of the interest areas, and clearly there's a lot of people that are trying to make a determination about some options between these two different sites. So we discussed that quite a bit. Then clearly capabilities between the Latin American countries vary. There's an interest in understanding those differences in more detail. The language, capabilities, cost, what are the factors to consider. So we spent some time on that, and clearly that's some of the questions were coming in that area. And clients also would like to understand how can I best leverage the Latin American option, where's the best approach to what's the best approach to do, and where are the best opportunities. And clearly perceptions of risk varied. I think we had some people who were clearly saying that, you know, they think there's a lot of perceptions of risk in the market, and there's still a lot of people who feel that with the media and a lot of the coverage about risk, it's hard to say, but clearly that everyone needs to take a good look at risk, both when sourcing offshore or looking at nearshore options. So what we did was we during the presentation we had a lot of questions. We answered what we could, but we had a lot of questions that came through that we just couldn't get to in the time frame. So what we did was distilled these down into a set of questions. And what we're going to do is we assembled a panel to go through these questions, and we'll Frank is going to lead us through. We'll give you good information, feedback on each one, and then hopefully we'll have some interaction during that, and then afterwards we'll have some time for some additional questions from you guys. Frank?
Great. So let's switch to the first question. The first question really had to do with what are some of the key cities in Mexico where outsourcing and services are delivered from. Now, a reminder for those of you in attendance, these are questions that you had asked, if you will, those that were previously in attendance. So, Tony, I'll steer that first one to you. You're certainly known as an expert in Mexico, among other places.
Okay, yeah, this is a great question. We had a lot of interest in this area, and I think it's both positive and negative. There's been a lot of media coverage about violence in Mexico. Really, if you look at Mexico, the major cities where you've got most of the sourcing coming from, you have Mexico City, the largest city, Monterrey, and in Monterrey you've got some technology parks that have been built, both Monterrey Technology Parks and Apodaca, and so you've got some emphasis coming from the governor as well. Guadalajara is a big center for IT especially. There's a technology park there as well. Also, these cities have universities. ITAM in Mexico City is one of the most popular and well-respected universities in Latin America for producing technical resources. Outside of Mexico City, pretty close, is Querétaro, and there's a lot of infrastructure and heavily fortified data centers that have been put in there. So a lot of clients and a lot of suppliers are leveraging those, and they have both dedicated centers as well as shared centers. So those would be the three major centers we have. There are other cities, the smaller ones, that have pockets, and Mexico is clearly trying to emphasize the spread of technology and technology services. But from an infrastructure and capabilities, those would be the three centers.
Okay, great. Thank you. So let's switch to question number 2. So question number 2 had to do with, really discuss how knowledge and capabilities compare to China and India. There was a particular question with regard to CMMI certification, if you will. So, Robert Jansen, let's start with you. Do you want to take a shot at that question?
Yes, I think that before we actually compared capabilities at the development and programming level, one needs to realize that that's not the only item you want to evaluate. You want to also understand what is the business acumen on the ground. Because, yes, we can have CMMI for development capabilities and yet do not have a full understanding of what the business environment for which you're developing it. So when you're trying to compare China and India with other locations in the nearshore space, you're not only looking at the CMMI capabilities, although there are plenty of companies in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, Costa Rica, Honduras, all over the nearshore map that have CMMI certification minimum level 2. You find 3, you find 5. But above all, I think one needs to realize that it's not just them following a set of best practices in the development level, but also being able to understand how that business application will be applied and into which context. And for that, it's necessary that they also have capabilities and full understanding in the business environment. And I think that's where probably some of the nearshore destinations stack up very well against China and India because they have very well-developed markets, such as Brazil, which has probably about around 45 strong different economic, well-developed sectors. So when you're actually developing for healthcare or for finance, you have actually on the ground CMMI level expertise, and on top of that, the business acumen for those verticals.
So, Robert, it's Frank. You're somewhat difficult to hear, and there's a little bit of an echo on your line. So if there's anything you could do to either speak louder or maybe...
is this better?
Say again?
Is this better?
Somewhat. So do the best you can. Yes. Okay.
I'll speak louder.
I'm getting some feedback that the answer is yes. Okay, super. So before I switch over to Bob Hartman, who I believe has an opinion or two on this, so are you? So just so I understand what you're saying, Robert, are you saying that it's not apples and apples, or is your sense that it's not the right question?
Well, what I'm trying to point out is that people, when they're looking for capabilities and best practices, should not be only looking for CMMI certification or vendor certification. Those things are important, yes, but also added to that, they should be looking at business expertise, because that's where really it's going to make it or break it. So what I'm saying is, when you're looking at to compare, don't just compare on the development certification level, but also on the business acumen level as well.
Okay, fair enough. So, Bob Hartman, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, let me weigh in for a second. I've got about 5 years experience working with Indian companies in the IT space when I was with Logica. And my experience with those guys, although they're very, very knowledgeable and great applications developers, they lack the segments that Robert was talking about. So to walk into an IT company in India and start talking about wanting to do something in the mobility space with an iPhone or fixed wireless telephone services or something, things that they probably don't have over there, you're not going to hit the ground running. And there's going to be a learning curve that they're going to have to go through, and that's going to affect your project.
Okay.
And your cost.
Okay. So just being that this is, it's an interesting question. I'm asked it quite often. Tony, maybe how would you weigh in? Is your sense?
Frank, I guess the way I look at this is India, I would say India and China, they're turning out resources at a very, very fast rate. So there's a lot of capability there, and I think at the very highest end, there are probably more resources available in India right now. But what I think you have to do is, first of all, there is, as Robert and Bob were saying, there's extensive experiences available, especially in the application development space that we were just talking about with CMMI. But one of the things I've learned that's really important is you really have to look at it from a perspective of what can you get for your particular situation from a particular supplier and evaluate it on that basis. So it's great if a vendor has CMMI level 5. But if you never get access to that, and you really don't want to pay for a very high level of CMMI level, you may say, you know what, I want to see what resources are going to be delivered to me, and what's the quality that I'm going to have on the ground, and what's their backup capabilities. And so at a macro level, I think you've got capabilities in Latin America that certainly can meet the bill for most application development and maintenance projects. The key is making sure you get the right level of detail, and that goes for India as well. I mean, we'll talk later about attrition rates and some other things, but I think it's important to make sure that is it viable? Yes. The question is just make sure in either case that you're comparing the resources that will be working on your particular project.
Okay, fair enough. So Arlene, let's get to the next question. So next question is, do you really believe that Latin America be an alternative for someone outsourcing to India or China? As you may recall, some of you may recall, you know, one of the emails that we had sent out to our members kind of touched on this topic, that we alluded to that, and some of you embraced it, and some of you challenged that. So Tony, let's go to you first. How would you answer that question?
Yeah, I've seen from real experience sourcing at both locations, and clearly, like I said, it's a viable alternative. And I think what I like to tell clients is that you don't, you know, to me, it's a great opportunity to put some diversity in your portfolio of sourcing options. And a lot of clients will say, well, so do they have the capabilities? And I think the answer is yes. The question is, okay, so what's the best mix of sourcing? We're going to talk a lot more detail about a lot of these attributes and get into them more, but I think from a general overview, the key thing that's happened over the last couple of years is that the costs of sourcing in Latin America is very competitive with U.S. rates. And what's happened is India and China are still cheaper. The question is how much cheaper. As those rates are going up in India and China, and you have higher attrition rates, what you're seeing in Latin America, because of the location, it's becoming a more viable option, so that gap is narrowing to the point where people say, you know what, with that kind of difference, it's not big enough to justify the higher risk of going offshore. So I think that's the difference. So we're clearly seeing capabilities of U.S. companies that are nearshoring, as well as companies within Latin America frequently will use sourcing options in other countries in Latin America, and have been doing that for a long time.
Okay, thank you. Bob, how do you see it? You know, kind of east, west, south, far east?
Yeah, I agree with Tony. I think the key is to have a sound strategy, develop a sound strategy. If a company's doing business in India today, don't necessarily yank it all out of there, but, you know, get into the whole regimen of multi-sourcing, where you might want to take some key functions and move them to another part of the world. I know when I was working in India a lot, what kept rearing its head was the unrest between India and Pakistan. And you've got to consider those kinds of things too when you start moving globally, is just how stable is the environment over there. You know, lack of political conflict or border disputes and things like that. So it just boils down to there's a lot to consider when you start thinking about this stuff. Frank?
Okay, super. So let's get to the next question.
Hey, Frank,
Yes.
what we'd like to do now is get another polling question.
Okay, go for it.
So just if you guys think about this, especially the people who are thinking about investing in utilizing Latin America, if you had $1 to invest, which area would you direct it to or allocate that towards? Hiring in-country salespeople. So if you're looking for penetrating that market, which would you look at? Hiring in-country salespeople, creating a dedicated marketing budget, upgrading technical and managerial skills, or other? Especially for you sellers out there, you know, what's your thinking as far as looking at that marketplace?
Okay, the poll will be closing in 10 seconds.
So interesting results. If you look at hiring in-country salespeople, creating a dedicated marketing budget, and upgrading technical and managerial skills, I think this tracks really closely to what I've seen. Clearly, upgrading the technical and managerial skills is a question. I think it's significantly better, but it's probably a thinner capability than we're used to in the U.S. And then having in-country salespeople, one thing I will say about Latin America is that a lot of business is done based on relationships and face-to-face contacts and connections and networking, and it's really important. So if you are doing business there, I think it's important to leverage that as much as possible. So I think that's another good a representation of reality. So,
and Tony, this is Frank again. If I could play off of that, what I've seen, whether it's providers actually, whether it's U.S. providers selling into a particular area of Latin America or a Latin America provider selling into the U.S. market, I'm agreeing with you that having that in-country presence is really critical, not only both from the sales and marketing strategy standpoint, but also from the standpoint of having the ability to invest and build relationships. I see far too many companies that are selling into a market that do not have a true presence in that market. And my sense is they're hoping that, let's kind of build the business and then we can invest in that later. And in many cases, later doesn't come. So it's just a matter of are you willing and able to make that investment up front. Robert, I'll put you on the spot. You have a pretty good Rolodex of players in Brazil. Do you see many of the Brazilian players from the standpoint of selling into the U.S. market? Do many of them get the importance of having a presence here in the States?
Well, they are starting to realize that in the recent years, especially with the uptake of the government's program called Brazil IT Plus. And one of them are really serious about it. They understand that if they don't show local commitment, it'll be very hard for them to get any traction in the market. Customers, clients, they want to make sure and want to be comfortable that you're going to be around for some time. They don't want to be having to face changing vendors at a time where they need actually to be piggyback ride and handheld through all the business objectives. So you see Brazilian companies more and more realizing that, yes, we need to be on the ground, yet they're also looking to see how they can do that in a creative way, because not all of them are funded in a way in which they can come out of a solo, like some of the companies that are in the United States currently, like Polytech, like Acmines, like CP and Braxis or Stefanini. There is a whole set of companies in Brazil that are Tier 2, Tier 3 that realize that, but right now they don't have the full capability of doing so. So the government steps in and they're pulling in these consortiums in which they can have a dominant, permanent presence on the ground. So yes, I see this, probably an upgrade on the fact that hiring new country salespeople, if we are to ask the same question 6 months down the road, I would venture to say that they'll probably see an increase on that percentage.
Okay. Robert, we're struggling to hear you a bit. Again, I'm just getting some feedback from those in attendance, so just do the best you can. That's all you can do. All righty, so we spent plenty of time, if we can get to the next slide, we spent plenty of time talking about Brazil, we talked about Mexico, India, China, and here is Latin America, which is a big place. So one of the questions from someone in attendance really had to do with let's discuss some of the other parts of Latin America here. So let's do that. Let's spend some time talking about some of these other places. And Bob Hartman, let's let's go to you on that. I think you're the most familiar.
Okay, yeah, let me speak about that a little bit. The leaders out of Latin America clearly are Brazil and Mexico. Argentina's probably running a close third, maybe not too close, but they're probably third considered in the rankings. But right now we're running Brazil and Mexico are the leaders down there. Just about all of the other countries are trying to get into the space if they aren't already into the space. Chile, Costa Rica, I'm hearing a lot about, Nicaragua, Colombia, Dominican Republic and Guatemala both tried to get into the space and really didn't do a good job. They failed, and the last that I heard, they were kind of backing out of that rather than invest any more money in it. Argentina, who everybody hears about, the problem with them, even though they're third in the leader category, their problem is labor pool. They don't have a real strong labor pool in Argentina. They're trying to fix that, but a lot of people feel that that's going to be a long time coming. It's not something that you just fix overnight. You've got to staff up the universities and get the kids through school. Brazil's got a great labor pool, as Robert alluded to a little bit earlier. Good labor pool, great technical universities, a good educational system. Chile is going to run in about the same as Argentina. They're a good country, but the labor pool is marginally good. They really don't have any experience with global expansion. They're kind of one of the new kids on the block, so they're going to struggle a little bit in the beginning. Costa Rica, who I've heard about a couple times during the last 3 to 6 months. Same thing. Got all the best of intentions, but they're really lacking in labor pool, and they're getting absolutely no government support, where Robert alluded to earlier about Brazil and all the money that the Brazilian government is spending to support these companies. There's no support coming out of the government of Costa Rica to help these companies do anything. And then, not to leave out Mexico, as we all know, they've got a good labor pool, pretty good language skills for the guys that are going internationally, some decent government support. I've been to a couple shows where, like Brazil, Mexico has had like a country booth, a country showcase. So they're definitely right up there in the leaders. Anybody else, the El Salvadors, I've heard a little bit about Panama, but they're really not doing anything right now. Panama gets some pretty good rating in some infrastructure, but they don't rate very high in a lot of the other categories that would be important to an American company thinking about considering them.
Okay,
Frank?
Bob, thank you. And I'm keeping an eye on the clock here. I want to make sure we get time for all these questions. So let's switch to question number 5, which really has to do with the attrition rates in Latin America versus India. Do you think the Latin American rates, and I guess this is a related question, do you think the Latin American rates will increase in the near or midterm? So attrition rates and I guess comparison LATAM versus India. Tony, you want to take the first pass at that?
Okay. Yeah, Frank. I think we talked about this in the last webinar, and there was a lot of questions and interest about attrition rates, and we spent a little more time looking into it in the time since that webinar, and we still see pretty wide ranges, but the numbers range between 5 and say 20%, and depending on the industry, and what we've seen is in captive centers, shared services, and in larger companies, you have a lot lower attrition rates, and so it's comparable to the U.S., but it's going to be a lower rate, much lower than India. If you move into, say, smaller web-based companies, you're going to get higher attrition rates just because people are jumping to different opportunities and things like that. But what we've seen over time is is it's kind of a significant difference between what we see in India and China, where you have a lot of churn and people moving just company to company for higher wages. And I think what we've seen is, and a lot has to do with the economy. With the economy being down, there's not as many jobs out there. I think people are a lot less likely to leave. Whereas you still see some pretty high growth rates in India and China. You're still seeing more churn over there. So what we are seeing is the attrition rate is a factor that would cause you to look more at Latin America than we see in India and China.
Okay. Robert Jensen, how would you answer that question?
Yes. Well, the LATAM rates, especially Brazil, they have been historically low compared to what we've seen happen in India and China, averaging around 10%. And one of the things that we see that is a probable reason for that, and here I'm going to quote one of our friends, Jacques Depoca, who handles the captive center for HSBC Bank in Curitiba. He was asking me the other day, Robert, do you know why that we are able to have a 0% onshore-offshore ratio here? He said, no, I said, well, not really. Well, have you ever been to the universities at daytime? What do you see? And actually, he was making a point of what you don't see is you don't see very many students because they're all there at nighttime. They're all studying at night. And the reason they're studying at night is they're working during the day. And normally, their work schedule is tied in with their schooling, and the companies they work for are somewhat supportive of that process. And because of the tie-in between their employer and their academic schooling, there is a longer commitment for them to stay on board on these companies. So you see, although small companies compared to the big guys, they still have also a low attrition rate because they are there supporting their collaborators in their schooling process. And mind you that they're starting school here at university quite young, 17, 18. And this is also one of the other reasons why the business acumen and the business setting is something like every other day business for any employee at any given company. So, and then again, we're hearing of the other far shore destinations just because of this ability of them to hop into the greener grass on the next door neighbor and a better salary has been upgrading or making the churn rates higher in India just because they want to get the next best job around the corner.
Great, thank you, Robert. So we touched on the government factor early on, but this particular question, number 6, is around, what are the governments doing to support these industries? Robert, is there anything that you could touch on that we haven't already said that discusses, again, that government factor, and obviously that's a key to success?
Well, you only see really government support for countries who are considered kind of developing countries, emerging countries, where they need to, where there's a big pool of small or mid-sized companies in that space, and therefore they need some additional push in order to penetrate different markets. So Brazil has its own program called Brazil IT Plus. There's Mexico IT, there's Romania IT. We have been seeing many other government initiatives from countries all over the world. And what they're trying basically to do is to showcase what size of talent pool they have, what are the current technical stack and offerings that they can bring to the table. And most of them, I think, get to what we call the bread and butter. I don't see any government program really being able to be like a laser beam matchmaker in between companies they try to represent and opportunities that might be around the world. Some governments do a little bit more than others as to the type and size of investments that they have. But they all face a very critical question in which they are trying to please big companies who have different dynamics and different agendas and smaller companies at the same time. And that's a very hard task to do. We see that happening also with the Brazilian government in which they're trying to adjust and please the top guns and still run a program that would address the needs of the smaller guys. And those smaller companies obviously have different needs. And I think that when governments look at their programs, they should be looking at those programs in which they should be tailor-made to these size companies and what technical stack and capability they have. Now, we also see that many companies, client organizations, when they see government involvement around these companies, they're more guided to accept that those are best-of-breed companies that are there just because they have government backing. So, looking forward, governments are in the right space of trying to push these companies, but they need to be a lot more business and results-oriented. I still see a little bit of what we call the scattered gun approach, the shotgun approach, in which they try to just blast out and see what sticks and just work it from there.
Okay, Frank, this is Tony, I was going to throw in also, in addition to what Robert's saying, one thing that I am seeing that's working well is tax-free zones, for example, where governments are granting tax-free zones or tax benefits to companies that are starting up services in Colombia, for example. You're seeing tax-free zones that enable more and more call centers to start up and branch off from a larger call center. And so you're seeing a lot better diversity. And that, to me, has been the most effective thing that's helping clients. I was talking to a provider down there, and they said without the tax-free zone, they couldn't have done it. But with it, it made it very, very easy to start up and be profitable quickly.
Let me just add to what Tony just said, Frank, is that also here, and he brings a very good point. Brazil, because of old labor laws, is faced in the services industry to try to be more competitive. So government's been pushing forward some new legislation to minimize the internal taxation on services so we can have a competitive offering worldwide. So this is another way also where government steps in with some of the specific public policy and try to bring a fiscal environment which is favorable for the country to become competitive.
So let me add this, gentlemen. There's a comment while you're talking about kind of tax-free zones. There's a comment from someone in attendance where she's saying that it is not true that there's no support from the government in Costa Rica. There are tax-free zones which have lots of benefits for foreign investors. So at least maybe just a clarification from somebody from that region.
Yeah, I think that, Frank, going back to that question, because I would have to say I see Costa Rica and Colombia especially, that those governments are pretty active, and as Robert was saying, especially it helps the smaller firms, but they definitely are helping from a marketing perspective. But I think, as Robert said, I don't think the marketing helps as much as those financial assistances, whether it's tax-free zones or providing incentives for other companies to do business down there. That's what's really making the difference. And I agree that, those up-and-coming countries like Chile, well, Chile is really established, but Costa Rica and Colombia, it's really helping them. And from what I've seen, especially from service providers down there, it's making a difference.
All right, super. Thank you, gentlemen. So let's switch to question 7. It has to do with time zones. Quite often you hear benefits of those touting NearShore, at least from the state's perspective. One of the benefits you hear are time zones. So let's talk for a few moments about the benefits to customers, and maybe even some examples. Bob Hartman, do you want to take a first pass?
Sure. Let me take a first pass at that. Here we're talking about project work for sure. My experience with India was that 10.5-hour time difference between the east coast of the United States and Bangalore was just an absolute drain on resources. You either had to come in early in the morning to have a conversation with your vendor over there, or stay late at night. It was very difficult. What I'm seeing today is an awful lot of interest, especially in the business, in the applications development space, seeing an awful lot of interest in a project being run under an agile Scrum framework. And under a pure agile Scrum framework, your Scrum master at the vendor would traditionally or typically speak to your project manager every day, once a day. And the time zone difference with Latin America really lends itself to tight communication, frequent communication. You're in the middle of a deliverable and something goes wrong. A new requirement comes up that you've got to get into the next release of the software. You know, for all of those project reasons that that it's imperative that you pick up a phone and you talk to your vendor. Latin America just fits that space very, very well, with currently Brazil being 1 hour ahead of the East Coast of the United States. When you're working, your project team's probably working. So it's a perfect situation for project work. Frank?
Okay. Robert Jensen?
Yeah, I think Bob illustrated it very well, because what you see is a lot of companies in the past with a long time zone difference, the next day after they got whatever they were expecting to get, were able to see if that was going to work or was going to fit whatever project they were working on. And they ended up, oh, we have to make adjustments here and there. Oh, okay, now we have to wait till 4 o'clock in the morning so we can be on their business day. Furthermore, the control and supervision issue, I believe, is one, what Bob was describing, is a very big advocate for the nearshore. A lot of companies who are now becoming an outsourcing addict or outsourcing fan, or using outsourcing as their strategy, they most likely want to be closer to their project. They will not want to have the project 7.5 time zones away and 13 hours of flying time. They want to be able to, on the same business day, get up on the phone and have a stand-up meeting, if they will, to make sure whatever's being developed on the plate is actually matchable to what is expected. So I think as the companies realize that they have to have a much closer intimacy to their project in the outsourcing space, and nearshore would be definitely a divider for them. It's where they can feel a lot more supervision and control. We actually had a study done in New York a year and a half ago with several companies who participated in some of the events that Brazil IT participates. And we asked them where were they currently outsourcing and where they expected to outsource in the next 18 months. And it was clear there that there was a trend moving from the far shore to the near shore. And the main reason for that was supervision and control. So I think that we're going to see a lot more nearshore play for those reasons.
Okay, gentlemen, according to my clock, we have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to see if we could do some kind of power panel play here. I'll do my best to buzz through on the questions. I want to see if it's possible, physically possible, to allocate a little bit of time on the back end for asking questions that will also be submitted. So I'm going to I want to have one question to one panelist. I'll ask if you could be as articulate and efficient time-wise with your answer. Let's just give it a try anyway. So we talked about time zones. Question number 8 is, which global service providers are in Latin America, and what kind of offerings? Now, I guess, that question itself could probably take about 15, 20 minutes, but, Robert, I'll come to you to say, are there a couple of major players that would be kind of on your people to speak to list?
Well, trying to be concise, I can tell you that the top 7 families from India, the top 7 guns, are here on the ground with local operations, and all the top guns from the United States are also here. And you have to look at the fact that IBM, HP now, EDS, Accenture, they have been here for a long time already.
Okay.
So what you're seeing now is a big move of the Tier 2 companies, because the Tier 1, only a few were not here, and the ones that were not are in a very fast pace of acquiring companies on the ground, so they have immediate local presence.
Okay. Yeah, when you say here, you're speaking to Brazil, and obviously that's your area of expertise.
South America. I'm actually
South
referring
America.
to
Yeah, okay. Fair enough. All right, good. So that helps. So let me fast forward to 9. Can you discuss unions in countries, especially Argentina, and the effect on the service industries? Robert, what do you know about unions in that part of the world?
Well, yeah, that's a very tricky issue. People don't sometimes overlook that when they're looking for setting up like a captive center, for instance, or setting up a development center. Well, first thing that one has to realize that most of the South American countries have very full labor laws, and those labor laws have an effect on your pricing at the outset. Furthermore, when you look at the services industry specifically, you have different unions for different types of services. So for telemarketing, for instance, you have a specific union for that, and then you have the smaller regional unions. So a union bylaws in São Paulo could be different than the one from the city of São Leopoldo in Rio Grande do Sul, just because the local city government, together with the syndicate, was able to provide for some different type of local legislation that will definitely have an impact on your pricing at the end. So overall, when one is going in, they want to make sure they look into the local unions and what type of effect they have on the final pricing of the people who are going to be handling those services and hiring for. And the tricky question here is there's not one single union that speaks for all categories. There are different unions in different places. This is the same for Argentina, the same for Brazil, also in Chile and Colombia. This is a result for having very old labor laws in place still. And as a result, you have the flourishing of all these different unions and syndicates, and they have a very big play in what the outcome of your pricing of labor will become.
Okay. So again, I'm keeping an eye on the clock here. I'm sure we could speak more about unions, but in the interest of efficiency, let's switch to question 10, which really talks the differences in cost versus India. What makes up the difference in the cost? Let's give Bob Hartman a shot to weigh in.
The difference in cost. It was in the past that India was just so far lower than the rest of the world that it was very, very difficult to compete on an hour-by-hour basis. With the things that we're hearing in the press about the development of a middle class in India and increased churn, which leads to increased wages, I'm seeing the India rates starting to really move up. A.T. Kearney did a study last year, and they said where normally the rates in the U.S. go up 5 to 10%, A.T. Kearney's predicting that Asia is going to continue at a 20 to 40% per year rate. I've got a friend that works in Bangalore. He's a Brit out of London, and he's having a real hard time keeping resources, development resources in the company. Because of this churn that's going on. These developers are pretty much chasing the dollar around right now. And he's having a hard time keeping his experienced people.
Okay.
Right?
Super, thank you. All right, we're just about there. Question 11 has to do with issues with regard to infrastructure and telecommunication from LATAM. Obviously that's been an issue with India. Apparently it hasn't had that much of an impact on their growth and dominance with regard to offshore outsourcing. Does that also play out with regard to Latin America? Tony, you want to take a shot?
I guess what I would say is, again, it depends, right? It depends on the region, the country. What most of your major cities have done a lot of investment in infrastructure. And in your major countries like Mexico and Brazil, it's you know, they've prepared with disaster recovery, business continuity. They've got major multinationals there that require it. As I was mentioning before, in Mexico, they're doing a lot of new development where they're building fortified data centers in a kind of a technology corridor, let's say. So you have multiple vendors that utilize those data centers with redundant telecommunications and things like that. So significantly improved. There's still issues with power, so you could have power outages in various places, but my experience has been the data centers, that they've got, you know, backup generators that work very well. So you know, it's looks like a U.S. data center if you approach it. So infrastructure-wise, I think it just when you start moving outside of the major cities and start moving to some of the smaller countries we talked about before, it's going to be more sporadic.
So Tony, in a minute, if you could answer this last question, and it has to do with this concept, this topic that's come up fairly often recently, and that is neutral Spanish. Which, in a nutshell, what countries would you say offer the best neutral Spanish?
This caused a lot of, this was an interesting question in the last webinar. There were a lot of comments that say, I disagree with the comments made about Argentina and other countries. So I really talked to a lot of people and asked some people in Mexico and other countries, and it was interesting. I think what I saw was the consensus was that Colombia and Guatemala had the most neutral Spanish. But it's kind of a hot topic, but that's what I heard as consensus. But let's see, Robert, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, actually, you know, a common mistake is thinking that common languages will equate common cultures. And yes, there is a big issue with who speaks better Spanish or who speaks what they call the true Spanish. But I take, for example, what Microsoft did a long time ago in the localization space. Most software by Microsoft localized to Spanish is localized in Costa Rica, because according to them, that's the most neutral Spanish of all. And they define neutral by the less contaminated by slang. So their Spanish in Costa Rica is the less contaminated by local colloquialism or local slang, and therefore it is acceptable to most other Spanish-speaking countries.
Okay, so here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to go over 10 minutes, if you gentlemen can do that. I mean, I'm not sure if any of you have a hard stop. Tony, Robert, Bob, can you go another 10 minutes?
I'm okay.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm fine.
Apologies to those in attendance if you do have a hard stop. What I want to do is I want to allocate time now, some very interesting questions and comments, which I want everyone to benefit from. I mean, so let's see here. Where do I begin? Comment here. Comments here. No, there are no unions in Costa Rica. Okay, just a comment. Let's see here. Comment with regard to proximity to U.S. is critical, especially for companies going to hire an outsourcing provider for the first time. So I guess any comments for first-time buyers with regard to the benefits of nearshore versus offshore? I'll go to you, Tony, on that. Is that something that makes it a little bit easier because of some of the things we mentioned for
Well,
maybe
I think,
for a city, if you will?
Yeah, a couple of comments. One, being close by, I mean, and it's cheap to fly there. For example, going from Houston to Mexico City, it's anywhere from $200 to $500 round trip. It kind of facilitates that, but I would say that one thing that can mitigate risk and make things simpler, maybe for the first time, is if you use maybe a global provider, and you may already have a relationship with them in the U.S. Sometimes it helps. I will tell you that doing business with IBM, let's say in Mexico or in Brazil, you're dealing with a different entity, so you do want to make sure that you know you're getting some backing from a relationship in the U.S., which I found to be very successful, and it works really well. But just because a company's global doesn't mean they operate globally. But it can mitigate your risk to do business with more of a global company than, say, a local company. And then when you're more mature, then maybe you move on to a where you could do it directly. Not to do a commercial, but I think having an advisor can also help you. Frank, are you still there?
I'm sorry. I had you on mute. Sorry about that. I'm trying to
Oh, no.
minimize the background. Thank you. So squeezing in as many as I can in the next 8.5, 9 minutes. Question here having to do with, this is actually a comment. Proximity also brings lower travel costs. I think it's a good thing to point out as people thinking of kind of total cost, right? You know, beyond the rates, if you will, total cost of overall management, governance, travel, and you could argue, depending on where you are, is that the cost to traveling to Mexico is going to be a lot less than if you're traveling to India or China. So I'll just share that. Let's see here. Whoops, trying to keep up. There's a bunch kind of fueling in now. How do you find the availability of supervisor and management level professionals in the region? Okay, so beyond, let's say, the worker bees, actual leadership, project management, supervisory. Any thoughts along those lines? I'll go to you, Bob Hartman.
Yeah, my experience has been favorable with that. I know the work that I've done in Brazil with Robert and with some other companies down there. For instance, Project Management Institute is very, very big in Brazil. And the majority of project managers that I've worked with over the last 6, 7 years have all been certified project managers or working towards certification. So they're not afraid to invest in their resources, bring the right managers up. Most of the companies that I've run into are recruiting right out of the top technical universities, and they're giving them all the skills they want, even to the point of bringing in English tutors and teaching conversational English during office hours at the end of the day or something. So my experience has been real good, especially on the project manager, Scrum Master side, Frank.
Okay. So
Frank,
Bob,
I wanted to add one thing about that. Is relative to India, I think you're seeing there's a large amount of younger workforce on average, and I think that's comparable to India. But if you're comparing it to the U.S., there's less, experienced managerial talent as a ratio to employees. So if that's just an expectation. Comparing to India, I think it's very favorable. Comparing it to the U.S., you do need to use some good governance and make sure that the people you have leading your projects and leading the whole account are experienced, and you probably want to go through a process to pick those and interview those and be very careful about it.
Okay. So there's another comment here, which I find is interesting. Similar business culture also lowers management costs. Do you agree with that, Tony?
I think so. Yeah, I think the culture and the proximity make it easier to manage. I will mention a couple things. Interestingly enough, conference calls don't really go over as well that I've seen as they do in the U.S. So, but I think the same thing goes for India. So having that some face-to-face contact periodically makes a big difference. But culturally, work ethic is a lot closer.
Okay. So someone here is looking for a recommendation, Bob Hartman. Question is, can you give any information on best LATAM countries for both web and software application development?
Well, they're all in that space because the web's so big today. My experience has been that the best companies that I've seen coming out of the web portal, integration to back office systems has been Brazil.
Okay.
I think one of the things we talked about last webinar, Frank, was that most of these companies, most of these countries have all gone towards a, more advanced application development and more advanced skills is what they're teaching in school. So if you're looking for legacy skills, you're not going to find nearly as much, and if you do, it's probably in Brazil because they have a kind of more of a mainframe heritage going way back. But most of the new skills are latest and greatest. Web development, portals, middleware, that kind of thing.
Okay. Okay, I'm skimming here. So this question relates to the certifications we discussed earlier. India may offer more CMMI level 5 companies, but how is that translated to value for clients that will do outsourcing for the first time who are not, let's say, more mature organizations? So again, there's a couple things. One is this reference to what seems to be the downplaying of certification, but also what seems to be implied here is benefits to a first-time outsourcer. Robert Jansen, do you see that playing out that way?
Well, yes, the CMMI certification is a two-way street. It requires a lot of maturity from the client organization to actually benefit from it. Furthermore, it has an added cost to it as well. So perhaps a first comer for an outsourcing project who is looking to reduce costs may not find that cost reduction very appealing because his overall outsourcing cost, because of the certification components and so forth, gives them a greater final price. Now, one of the things that, compared to other places, and we were challenged recently on a NearShoring panel as well, a live one in New York, in which China and India were planning to putting out about 125,000 IT professionals with over 150 IQ per year. And they were asking what Brazil was doing in that sense. And I said, well, Brazil's not doing anything to that nature. We're actually focusing more on the added value approach and not so much on the vanilla mainstream. Because we're talking about high-level left-brain thinking. You're talking about commoditization. So what we're looking at is where actually we can add value because you have business acumen, because you have speed and adaptability. You can hit the ground running. There are no cultural barriers. You have, as mentioned before, a good business etiquette. Your work ethics are very similar. So I think the cultural alignment for a first comer are going to be a lot more important than the actual certification. Looking at the technological stack, making sure communication channels work well, either be Skype conference call, or be just a regular phone call, but the people on both sides are communicating well and are on a common ground of understanding. So I think the overall culture and business setting alignments are a lot more crucial for a first-timer than the certification itself.
Hey, Frank, I wanted to add, we did a deal in Mexico, and we had the vendor commit to, getting the client to a CMMI level 3 in a period of time, similar to what we do in the U.S., and they brought in resources to do that, and, they can do it. So, again, I agree with Robert. It's really about what do you want to pay for and where is the business benefit from that, and we could have a whole webinar on CMMI, but,
okay.
So.
All right, thank you. So let's start wrapping, and Arlene, I'm not sure if there's another slide that maybe is kind of a closeout slide with all the, okay, there's our commercial, right? So a couple things as far as following up on this. One is I want to let everyone know that we do a lot more of this at our road shows, and that's part of why we're doing some of these non-sponsored webinars to engage you all in dialogue that we will continue from this, we're starting with this virtual dialogue that we plan on continuing locally and regionally, if you will. So if you're not familiar with the roadshow, go to outsourcing.com, or you can actually go to outsourcing.com/roadshow. We'll get you right there. As I mentioned, Bob Hartman will be chairing D.C., and Tony will be in Houston, and I'll be at a couple of them. Robert Jansen will be at a couple of them. So we hope to see you all there. And in addition to that, I'm not sure if there's a slide with everyone's contact information on it. There we go. I'll figure this out eventually, Arlene. Thank you. So I'm sure that that you have additional questions. I want to encourage you to reach out to our panelists here, who are truly experts in their field. These guys have a wealth of knowledge, and so as you go forward, you want to connect, you build your Rolodex. Maybe you need an advisor or consultant. Please reach out to these gentlemen. Some we know for a handful of years, some we know for many years. They're all good guys. They've been in this business for 20, 30 years each. Excellent background. I highly recommend them. So I would encourage that as well. Last thing I would ask each of you in attendance to do before you go is we'd love to get a sense from you as to what you would like us to cover on the next Latin American webinar. So if you have an idea of a topic, a theme, just drop a note right into the question box there. We take that very seriously. I'd love to do this again with this panel and just kind of rock and roll from there. And rather than us pick a theme, we'd rather make sure we're kind of dead on as far as topics that are important to you, whether it has to do with pricing or certification or marketing or cultural issues. Give us your feedback. We'll leverage that for future webinars and also for future speaking opportunities at the road shows. So that said, thank you for all of you who have made this session. Hopefully it was as worthwhile as the previous one was for you, if you will. And thank you again to our panelists. Tony, thank you. Robert and Bob, thank you all very much. And to everyone else, have a great day.
Thank you, Frank.